I drive long haul for a produce distributor out of Sacramento, mostly refrigerated trailers, lettuce and stone fruit, the kind of freight that doesn't wait for you if your truck breaks down. I've been doing it for 6 years. My dad drove for 30 before his knees gave out, so I grew up in the cab of a truck before I ever drove one myself. I say that because I want you to understand I'm not someone who spooks easy. I've slept in truck stops in East St. Louis. I've had guys bang on my door at 3 a.m. trying to sell me things I didn't want. I've had my rig searched by DOT at a scale house in the middle of a thunderstorm. None of that ever really got under my skin. This did. It was late October, a Tuesday, and I was running a load of Bartlett pears from a packing house outside Medford, Oregon, down to a distribution center in Las Vegas. My dispatcher, a guy named Curtis, who I'd worked with for 3 years, routed me a way I didn't usually go. Instead of I-5 down through Sacramento and cutting over, he had me drop south through Nevada on Highway 6, the old 2-lane that cuts through the middle of nothing between Ely and Tonopah. I asked him why, and he said something about a bridge closure on my normal route and that Route 6 would save me 4 hours. I didn't argue. 4 hours is 4 hours when you're getting paid by the mile and sleeping in 15-minute increments. If you've never been on Route 6 through central Nevada, I don't know how to explain it except to say that it's one of the loneliest stretches of road in the country. They actually call part of it that on road signs the loneliest road in America, though that's technically Route 50 a bit north. Route 6 is worse, if you ask me, because at least 50 has little towns strung along it like Eureka and Austin. Route 6 is almost nothing. You can drive for 90 minutes and not see another car. Just sagebrush, dry lake beds, and mountains that look the same color as the sky at dusk, like the whole landscape is holding its breath. I left the packing house around 6 p.m., which put me hitting the Nevada stretch of 6 close to midnight. I remember checking my dash clock, 11:52 p.m., right around the time I crossed into Nevada from the Ely side, heading southwest. My phone had already lost signal an hour before that. I had a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm, a country station fading in and out, and about 400 more miles to go before I'd even think about pulling into a rest area. Around mile marker 90 or so, I passed a car pulled off on the shoulder. Hazards blinking. It's not that unusual to see that out there. People run out of gas, blow a tire, whatever. But something about it made me slow down without really deciding to. It was an old sedan, maybe a Buick, silver or gray, hard to tell in headlights. Nobody was standing near it. No dome light on inside, just the hazards clicking in the dark like a slow heartbeat. I didn't stop. I've been told 100 times by other drivers, especially the guys who've done this stretch for years, that you don't stop for stranded cars out there at night unless it's an obvious family, kids in the back seat, that kind of thing. You call it in when you get signal instead. So I made a mental note of the mile marker and kept going, and I told myself I'd radio it in on my CB in case any other truckers close by had eyes on it, and if not, I'd call the Nevada Highway Patrol non-emergency line when I got signal back. I didn't think about it again for maybe 40 minutes. Then a little after 1 a.m., my dash clock reading 107, I saw headlights coming up behind me in my mirror. Way behind me, but coming fast. Faster than you'd want to be going on that road at night, where the pavement dips and there are cattle guards you don't see until you're on top of them. I remember thinking, whoever that is, they're either in a huge hurry or they don't know this road. The headlights closed. It didn't feel right. I was doing 62, which is close to the limit for a loaded rig on that stretch, and this car came up on me fast enough that I had time to think it was going to pass, and then it didn't pass. It just sat there, maybe 2 car lengths off my rear bumper, high beams on, filling my whole cab with light through the mirrors. I flicked my running lights, the little signal truckers used to say, "Hey, ease up," and nothing changed. I slowed down to 55, thinking maybe they'd go around. They slowed down too, matching me almost exactly. I remember the specific stupid detail that the radio had just started playing a Chris Stapleton song, Tennessee Whiskey, and I turned it down without thinking, like I needed to concentrate harder, like sound was somehow in the way. This went on for almost 11 miles. I know because I watched the odometer. 11 miles of a car sitting on my bumper with brights on, never closing the distance further, never dropping back, just there, silent, blinding. I did the thing you're supposed to do, which is nothing dramatic. I didn't slam the brakes. I didn't swerve. I just kept a steady pace and watched. Somewhere around mile marker 71, there's a long, gentle curve where the road bends around a dry wash, and as I came into the curve, the car finally pulled out to pass. I remember feeling relief for about 4 seconds. Then it didn't complete the pass. It came up alongside me. A gray sedan. and my stomach dropped because it looked like the same car I'd seen stalled on the shoulder and matched my speed exactly, staying right beside my cab door, close enough that if I'd looked straight down, I could have seen inside it if the window had been down. The window was down. I looked. I don't know why I looked. I think some animal part of my brain needed to know what I was dealing with. There was a man driving, alone as far as I could tell. Middle-aged maybe, though it's hard to say precisely in that light. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking straight up at me, at my window, with an expression I keep trying to describe to people and failing. It wasn't anger. It wasn't scared. It was closer to the way you'd look at something you were deciding whether to buy. Calm, appraising, patient. He held that pace beside me for maybe 15 seconds, which does not sound like a long time until you try counting it out loud while imagining a stranger's face 6 feet from your window on an empty highway at 1 in the morning. Then he dropped back behind me again. I did the only thing that made sense in the moment, which was call it in on the CB, hoping another trucker somewhere down the line had ears on. I got a response from a woman driving a Werner Enterprises rig about 40 minutes ahead of me, going the same direction. Her handle was Dust Devil. I remember being grateful for her voice in a way that felt almost embarrassing, like I was a kid again, scared of the dark, and somebody had just turned on a hallway light. The gray sedan stayed behind me for another 20 minutes. Then, without warning, its headlights swung off the road entirely. I watched in my mirror as it turned down what I assumed was some dirt track or ranch access road, and the taillights shrank and disappeared into the dark like they'd never been there. I didn't relax. If anything, that was worse, because now I didn't know where he'd gone, and every set of headlights after that, for the rest of that drive, made my hands go tight on the wheel. I made it to the junction with US 95 around 2:40 am, merged onto a road that at least occasionally had other traffic, and I didn't feel like I could breathe right until I saw the lights of a Chevron sign near Tonopah. I pulled in, parked under the brightest light in the lot, and sat there with the engine running for probably 10 minutes before I trusted myself to get out and use the bathroom. Here's where it gets specific in a way that still bothers me. Inside the gas station, there was a kid working the counter, maybe 20, wearing a flannel and one of those beanies with a little brim. I bought a Red Bull and a bag of sunflower seeds, and while I was paying, I mentioned, half joking, half not, that some guy in a gray sedan had been riding my bumper out on 6. I wasn't expecting a reaction. I just needed to say human being. The kid's face changed. Not dramatically, just a small shift like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. He said, "Gray Buick?" I told him I hadn't seen a dent. It had been dark, but yeah, gray, older, sedan. He nodded slowly and said there'd been a guy doing that out on 6 for a couple years now, on and off. Not every week, not even every month, but every so often a trucker or a late-night driver would come through Tonopah talking about the same thing. A gray car riding their bumper for miles, then pulling alongside, then vanishing down a side road. He said the sheriff's department out of Nye County had looked into it a couple times, but nobody ever got a plate number, because the guy, if it was always the same guy, never had a front plate, and it was too dark to catch the rear one while he was matching your speed. I asked if anyone had ever actually been hurt. The kid hesitated in a way that made me wish I hadn't asked, and said there'd been a story, a couple years back, about a woman driving alone who'd pulled over on 6 because her hazards had been going off. Car trouble, or maybe she'd stopped for something else, nobody was totally sure, and she was never heard from again. He said it fast, almost like he wanted to get the sentence over with, and then he said, "But that might just be a story people tell. I don't actually know if that's real." I want to be honest that I don't know if that detail is true. I never found her name, never found a news article, and I've looked, on and off, for 2 years since. Maybe it's just the kind of story that grows in a place like that, a highway so empty that people need to explain the emptiness somehow, need a reason for why it feels the way it does at 1 am. What I do know is what happened to me, and what happened to me was real, because I still have the delivery timestamps from that run, still have the fuel receipt from that Chevron in Tonopah, timestamped 2:53 am. That part isn't a story. That part is a piece of paper in a folder in my truck. I finished the run to Vegas without incident. I told Curtis I didn't want that route again, and he didn't ask why, just rerouted me without comment, which made me wonder if I wasn't the first driver to say something like that to him. Here's the detail that still gets me, though, more than the headlights or the 11 miles or the man's face in the window. When I was pulling out of that Chevron, headed toward the interstate, I glanced at my side mirror out of habit, the way you do 100 times a shift without thinking. For half a second, in the lot behind me, under the fluorescent lights by the propane cage, I thought I saw a gray sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, engine off, no one visible inside. I turned my head to look directly at it, not through the mirror, actually turned and looked out the window at where it should have been. There was nothing there, just an empty stretch of asphalt and a shopping cart somebody had left against the ice machine. I've told myself 100 times it was exhaustion, that I'd been awake for 19 hours by that point, and my eyes were doing what tired eyes do. Almost every time, I believe that. It's just that every once when I'm alone on some other empty stretch of road somewhere in the country, doing the exact same job I've done for 6 years, I'll glance at my mirror out of habit, and for one dumb animal second before my brain catches up, I'm back on Route 6, watching a pair of headlights close the distance behind me. I still drive for a living. I still take night runs. But I keep an actual paper road atlas in my cab now, next to the GPS, and if a dispatcher ever tries to route me through central Nevada after dark again, I tell them I'll take the 4 extra hours. Story 2. The light on Forest Road 94. I moved to Catron County, New Mexico in March of 2024, which, if you don't know the geography, is the least populated county in the continental United States. Fewer than 3 people per square mile. I moved there for a job as a veterinary technician at a large animal practice out of Reserve, the county seat, which sounds impressive until you understand that Reserve has a population of about 300 people and one stoplight that I'm not even sure functions anymore. I'm not from there originally. I grew up in Albuquerque, went to school for vet tech certification at Central New Mexico Community College, and took the Reserve job because it paid better than anything I could find in the city, and because the practice owner, a woman named Dr. Priscilla Ahn, offered to knock $400 a month off rent on a little house she owned out on Forest Road 94, about 11 miles outside town, if I'd take. I was 26, single, tired of roommates, and the idea of my own house with a wraparound porch and actual quiet sounded like a dream. I didn't think enough about what that kind of quiet actually means until I was living in it. The house sat at the end of a gravel drive, surrounded on 3 sides by Gila National Forest, with the nearest neighbor almost 2 miles away, a rancher named Wade Pruitt who ran cattle on land that bordered mine. I had a landline because cell service out there is a joke. One you stand on the porch or phone up at a specific angle. Nothing at all inside the house. I had a dog, a red heeler mix named Scout, that Dr. Ahn's clinic had taken in as a stray and that I'd more or less adopted by default. For the first 4 months, I loved it out there. I loved the silence, the stars, the way the elk would come down into the meadow behind the house at dusk. I used to sit on the porch with a beer and watch them and think I'd made the right call moving out there. The first thing that felt wrong happened in July, a Thursday night, and at the time I genuinely believed it was nothing. I'd gotten home from a late emergency call, a rancher's horse with colic, ugly night, didn't get back until almost midnight, and Scout was standing at the tree line at the edge of the yard, barking in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Not the bark she gave deer or elk, which was more of an excited yip. This was low, steady, aimed at one spot in the trees, and she wouldn't come when I called her. I stood on the porch in my scrubs, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the tree line, and I didn't see anything. But I had this distinct, uncomfortable sense of being looked at. I told myself it was a bear. We had black bears in that area, and a bear at the tree line would absolutely explain Scout's reaction. I went inside, locked the door, which I don't think I'd bothered to do more than a handful of times since I'd moved in, and didn't think much more about it. 3 weeks later, the second thing happened, and this one I couldn't explain away as easily. I came home from work around 6:30 p.m., and the porch light, which I always left on a timer, was off. Not burned out. Off like someone had flipped the switch. I checked the switch and it was in the off position. I remember standing there in the dusk light with my keys in my hand, running through possibilities. A power flicker resetting the timer, maybe. Wade Pruitt stopping by and accidentally bumping it. Though that made no sense because he'd have had to come up onto my porch to do that. And Scout would have lost her mind if a stranger had been on the property while I was gone. I flipped it back on and went inside and didn't sleep well that night, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. By August, the incidents were frequent enough that I started keeping a mental list, and eventually an actual list, in the Notes app on my phone, which I could only sync when I drove into town and got signal. Small things. A gate at the edge of my property that I always left latched, found unlatched. A pair of muddy boot prints on the porch steps one morning that didn't match my boots or Wade's. Size large, tread pattern I didn't recognize. Gone by the time I thought to photograph them because it rained that afternoon and washed them out. Scout, who had always slept in my room, started sleeping at the foot of the stairs instead, facing the front door. And I started letting her, because some part of me had stopped needing convincing that something was actually happening. The thing that broke the dam, so to speak, happened on September 9th, a Monday. I remember the date exactly because I'd taken that day off to drive into Silver City for a dentist appointment, a good 90 minutes each way, and I didn't get home until almost 7 p.m., exhausted, hungry, wanting nothing more than to feed Scout and go to bed early. When I walked into the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was a smell. Cigarette smoke. I don't smoke. Nobody who'd been in my house recently smoked as far as I knew. It was faint, but it was there, threaded into the air in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up before my brain had even fully processed what I was smelling. The second thing I noticed was that a chair at my kitchen table had... I live alone. I don't pull chairs out and leave them that way. I keep a tidy house, partly out of habit from vet tech work where cleanliness matters, partly because with just me and the dog there's no reason for anything to be out of place. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. Maybe 2 full minutes, just looking at that pulled-out chair, running through every possible explanation, and coming up with nothing that made sense. I called Wade on my landline once I worked up the nerve to move, and he came over within 20 minutes with a shotgun and his own dog, a blue heeler named Biscuit, and we walked the whole property together, checked every window, every door, the shed out back, the crawl space under the porch. Nothing. No sign of forced entry anywhere. My back door, which I always locked, was locked when I'd arrived home. Both my front and back doors were locked. Wade said something that night that I've turned over in my head 100 times since. And I told him I was sure because I remember specifically checking it twice, a habit I'd developed since the boot prints. He didn't push it further, but I could tell he didn't quite believe the locked door part. And honestly, some small treacherous part of me started to wonder if I was losing my grip on things, if the isolation was getting to me the way people sometimes warned it might. I want to be clear that I am not someone prone to paranoia. I'd worked night shifts in emergency vet clinics in Albuquerque, dealt with aggressive drunk clients, handled genuine crises without falling apart. I trusted my own judgment. But living alone 11 miles outside a town of 300 people, with no cell signal and a 2-mile gap to my nearest neighbor, has a way of making you question things you'd never question anywhere else. I started sleeping with the bed. I bought a trail camera from the hardware store in Reserve and set it up facing the tree line where Scout had barked back in July. For 2 weeks, it caught nothing but a bobcat and, once, memorably, Wade's cattle that had wandered onto my side of the fence. Then, on September 24th, the camera caught something else. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. The footage is grainy, black and white, that flat infrared look trail cameras get at night. A figure stands at the tree line, not moving, for what the timestamp shows is 11 minutes. Just standing there, facing the house. I can't make out a face. I can't make out much of anything except a human shape. Average height, wearing what might be a jacket, hood up or hat on, hard to tell. At the 11-minute mark, the figure turns and walks back into the trees, unhurried, like someone leaving a place they'd visited 100 times before and had no reason to rush from. I drove that footage into Reserve the next morning and showed it to the one sheriff's deputy stationed out there, a guy named Tom Iverson who covered an area roughly the size of Connecticut by himself most days. He took it seriously, I'll give him that. He came out, looked at the tree line, walked the property, took a statement, told me to install motion sensor lights, which I did within the week. He said there wasn't much else he could do without a clearer image or an actual incident, and he gave me his cell number, which worked about half the time given the signal. For a month after that, nothing happened, and I let myself believe it was over, that whoever it was had been scared off by the camera or the lights, or simply moved on to whatever they'd been doing before they found my property. Then came the night that made me leave for good, on October 19th, a Saturday. I want to walk through this slowly because it's the part I still can't fully explain, and it's the part that follows me. I woke up at 3:14 a.m. I remember checking my phone, useless as it was for signal, but still functioning as a clock, because Scout was standing rigid at my bedroom door, not barking, just staring at it, every muscle locked. I could hear something, not loud, barely audible actually, which somehow made it worse. It sounded like breathing, slow, deliberate breathing coming from just outside my bedroom door. I lay there frozen for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, gripping the baseball bat, trying to convince myself it was the house settling, wind through a gap somewhere, anything but what it sounded like. Then I heard footsteps, unhurried, moving away from my door down the hallway toward the front of the house. I heard the front door open. I heard it close, softly, like someone being careful not to wake me. I did not go check. I want to be honest about that. I lay in bed with Scout pressed against my legs until the sky started to lighten. And then I called Wade the moment I had enough signal to get through, and I packed a bag while I waited for him. And when he and Deputy Iverson both showed up within the hour, they found the front door unlocked, though I'd locked it myself the night before, checked twice, same as always. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints this time, ground too dry, no trail camera footage, because in the panic of the previous days I'd forgotten to check the batteries, and it had died 3 days earlier. I moved into a rental in Reserve proper within 2 weeks, an actual apartment above the pharmacy with neighbors on either side and streetlights outside my window, and I never went back to that house on Forest Road 94, not even to collect the last of my things. Wade did that for me and dropped them off in town.
Dr. Ahn told me months later, almost offhand, that the house had sat empty for nearly 2 years before I rented it, and that the tenant before that, a hunting guide, had moved out abruptly too, mid-lease, no explanation given, forfeited his deposit rather than deal with the landlord about it. I asked her if she knew why. She said she'd always assumed it was the isolation getting to him, same as she'd assumed about me, and I let her think that, because I didn't have a better explanation to offer, and because some things you don't really want confirmed. I still live in Catron County. I still work for Dr. Ahn. I still have Scout. I just don't live alone in the woods anymore, and if I drive past Forest Road 94 now, which I try not to do, I don't look down that gravel drive, because there was one detail from that last night that I never told Wade or Deputy Iverson. One till now. When I finally checked my phone's voice recorder app, which I'd started keeping running most nights after the trail camera footage, out of some instinct I couldn't fully justify, there was a recording from that night, 3:11 to 3:19 a.m. Mostly it's just my own breathing, and Scout's, and the low hum of the refrigerator down the hall. But at 3:16, right around when I remember the footsteps moving away from my door, there's a voice, very quiet, barely more than a whisper, and it isn't mine, and it isn't anything I recognize, and it says 4 words I've never been able to make sense of and never told anyone the exact wording of, because saying them out loud makes them feel more real than I want them to be. I still have that recording. I've never deleted it. I've also never played it for anyone else, and some nights in my apartment above the pharmacy, streetlights right outside my window, I'll wake up at 3 a.m. for no reason at all and lie there listening to nothing and think about that pulled-out chair and wonder who used to say. Story 3. The 213 customer I worked the overnight shift at a Chevron just off Interstate 10 in Sierra Blanca, Texas, from January to April of 2025. If you've never heard of Sierra Blanca, that's not surprising. It's a town of a few hundred people out in Hudspeth County, about 90 minutes east of El Paso, mostly known, if it's known for anything, as the place where the Border Patrol runs an immigration checkpoint on the interstate, and where a couple of celebrities have gotten arrested for drug possession over the years while passing through. Otherwise, it's just desert. Creosote bushes, the Sierra Blanca mountains rising up gray and jagged to the south, and a whole lot of nothing stretching out in every direction under a sky so big it makes you feel very small. I was 22, taking classes part-time at El Paso Community College, living with my aunt in Fort Hancock because rent was cheap and family was free. The overnight gig at the Chevron paid better than anything comparable in El Paso proper because nobody wanted to drive that far out or work that shift, and I needed the money for tuition, so I took it. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 nights a week, alone in the store from midnight until my coworker Hollis Trent came in to help with the morning rush around 6. For the first month, it was boring in the specific way overnight retail jobs are boring. Long stretches of nothing punctuated by truckers coming through for coffee and diesel. The occasional Border Patrol agent grabbing a Red Bull between shifts. A handful of exhausted families driving through the night to save on a hotel room. I did my reading for class behind the counter, restocked shelves, kept the coffee fresh, and mostly enjoyed. My manager, a heavy-set, kind man named Gary Delfino, checked in by phone a couple times a shift, and otherwise I was on my own out there, which suited me fine. The first time I noticed the man was February 6th, a Thursday. I remember because I'd just started my shift and was still setting up the register when he came in, a little after midnight. He was maybe 50, average height, wearing a canvas jacket that looked too heavy for the mild winter weather we were having, and he bought a black coffee, paid in cash, exact change, and left without saying more than thanks the entire time. Nothing unusual about any of that on its own. Truck stops get all kinds. What I noticed at the time
was that he came back the following Thursday. Same time, almost to the minute. My register log later confirmed it, 12:06 a.m. both nights. Same order, black coffee, same exact change, same canvas jacket. He didn't say much beyond thanks again, and I filed it away as one of those small-town patterns you notice without really caring about, a regular nothing more. By the third Thursday, February 20th, I'd started noticing him more carefully, mostly because something about his eye contact had started to bother me. He'd look at me while I made his change, hold it a beat too long, then look away. Not aggressive, not leering, exactly. Just longer than felt normal, like he was checking something, confirming something. The thing that actually put me on edge happened the fourth Thursday, February 27th, at 12:13 a.m., according to the register log, which by then I'd started paying closer attention to, almost like I was keeping score. It wasn't a question. I remember the specific chill of that, not "do you always work Thursdays," but "you always work Thursdays," stated flatly, like a fact he already possessed and was simply confirming out loud. I said something like, "Yeah, 4 nights a week," trying to keep my voice light, and he nodded slowly, took his coffee, and left. I called Gary the next day and told him about it, and he was sympathetic but practical, the way small business managers tend to be. He said if the guy did anything overtly threatening, call the sheriff's office, but a customer commenting on your schedule wasn't itself a crime, and switching my shifts around wasn't really feasible given how thin our staffing already was. I understood the logic, even as it didn't make me feel any better. I started noticing things about the timing after that. He never came at exactly the same minute twice, but always within a window, always between 12 and 12:20 a.m., always on a night I was working. I started to wonder, with a growing unease I tried to talk myself out of, whether he was tracking my schedule somehow, or whether it really was coincidence, since I did in fact work a fairly predictable rotation. The store had a security camera system, 4 cameras, 1 over the register, 1 on each aisle, 1 on the fuel pumps outside. I started pulling up footage on slow nights, going back through old recordings, trying to see if I could spot him on nights I wasn't working, to prove to myself it was random. Gary's system only kept 30 days of footage before it overwrote itself, so I could only go back so far, but in the footage I could access, every single appearance of the man in the canvas jacket lined up with a night I was on shift. Every one. By mid-March, I'd started asking Border Patrol agents who came through. There were a handful of regulars, guys who worked the checkpoint and came in most nights for coffee, whether they recognized him. One agent, a guy named Ruben Anaya, who I'd gotten friendly with over the months, said the description sounded familiar, but he couldn't place a name to it, and he offered, without me really asking, to swing through the lot a little more often on nights I was working. I appreciated that more than I let on. The night everything changed was March 20th, a Thursday, and I remember the date with total clarity because it was also the night of a total lunar eclipse, which I'd been half paying attention to on my phone between customers, checking a live stream during the slow stretches. The store was dead quiet, no customers for almost 40 minutes, just me, the hum of the coolers, and the eclipse live stream buffering on my phone propped against the register. At 12:04 a.m., the bell over the door chimed, and I looked up expecting the usual black coffee order. It wasn't him. It was a stranger, someone I'd never seen before, a younger guy, maybe 30 in a hoodie, who bought a pack of cigarettes and a lighter and left without saying much. Ordinary interaction. I remember feeling a small, guilty relief that it wasn't the canvas jacket man, followed almost immediately by a strange unease I couldn't place. The kind where your body knows something before your brain catches up. It took me almost 10 minutes to figure out what had bothered me. The hoodie guy had paid in cash, and when he'd handed me the bills, his change had come out to be exact, like he'd counted it in advance, the way canvas jacket guy always did. I told myself it was nothing, that plenty of people count exact change, especially truckers and locals who deal in cash regularly out in a place like that. At 12:41 a.m., the canvas jacket man came in. Same order. I told him I didn't know what he meant, voice tighter than I wanted it to be. He said, "The one that just left." Then he smiled, just slightly, paid, and left, and I stood behind the counter with my hands actually shaking because there was no way, no reasonable way, for him to have known another customer had been in the store 40 minutes earlier unless he'd been watching, unless he'd seen the hoodie guy leave, or unless the two of them were somehow connected in a way I didn't want to think too hard about. I called Gary immediately, and then I called Ruben Anaya, who came by within 15 minutes, even though it wasn't technically his patrol area, and we pulled the footage together. The camera over the fuel pumps had caught a car in the lot around 12:30 a.m., parked at the far edge near the air pump, not at a fuel island, just sitting there. Grainy, dark, hard to make out details, but it looked like it might have had two people in it, though the footage wasn't clear enough to be certain. It pulled away at 12:39, 2 minutes before Canvas Jacket Guy came in. Ruben took it seriously enough to file an actual report, which was more than I'd expected, and he told me, matter-of-factly, that this kind of pattern, a customer tracking an employee's schedule, potentially working with somebody else to surveil the store, wasn't something to take lightly out in a place as isolated as Sierra Blanca, where response times could run 20-30 minutes, even in a good scenario. I quit 2 weeks later. Gary was understanding about it, more understanding than I expected, and told me, almost as an aside while processing my last check, that a cashier before me, a woman named Odalis, had left the job rather abruptly back in 2023 too, and that he'd always assumed it was just the overnight hours getting to her, the isolation, same story he'd have told about me if I hadn't explained why I was leaving. He said he'd never connected it to anything specific before, but now hearing my story, he wasn't so sure. I never saw the Canvas Jacket Man again after my last shift, obviously, since I stopped going out there. I checked in with Ruben a couple of times over the following months, and he said the sheriff's office never got a clear enough picture or plate to identify him, that the description, average build, 50s, canvas jacket, older sedan, sometimes seen in the lot, matched too many people to narrow down, and that without an actual crime committed, there wasn't much more they could do beyond keeping an informal eye on the store. I finished my degree at UTEP eventually, work in an office in El Paso now, 9 to 5, more people around me than I could ever want, which after Sierra Blanca feels like exactly what I need. But there's a detail from that last night I never told Gary or Ruben, something I only remembered clearly a few weeks later, going back over it in my head the way you do with things that won't let you go. When Canvas Jacket Guy said new boyfriend, he'd smiled that small smile I mentioned, and I'd been so focused on the wrongness of what he knew that I hadn't registered until much later replaying it in my mind while trying to fall asleep one night, that his eyes hadn't been on me when he said it. They'd been on the security camera mounted over the register, the one pointed straight at both of us, like he wasn't talking to me at all, like he was talking to whoever might be watching the footage later. I still don't know what that means, or if it means anything. I've never gone back to Sierra Blanca. I still sometimes check the address on Google Street View, an old habit I can't quite break, and the imagery hasn't updated in a while, so the store still shows up the way it looked when I worked there, lit up under the desert night sky, empty lot, nobody in frame. I tell myself that's like a photograph, nothing more. But every time I pull it up, I find myself looking at the edges of the frame first, at the shadows near the fuel pumps, before I let myself look anywhere else. Story 4. 9 miles from the Trailhead, I've been backpacking since I was a teenager, mostly because my dad took me and my brother on trips through the Bitterroots every summer growing up in Missoula, Montana. By the time I was 30, in the summer of 2025, I'd logged solo overnight trips all over the state, and I considered myself careful about it. I always filed a trip plan with someone, always carried a satellite messenger, always checked weather and fire conditions obsessively before heading out. I work as a graphic designer, freelance, which means my schedule is flexible enough that I can disappear into the backcountry for 4 or 5 days at a stretch whenever the stress of deadlines gets to be too much, and that August it had gotten to be too much. I planned a solo trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which locals just call the Bob, a nearly 1 million acre wilderness complex in northwest Montana, one of the largest roadless areas in the lower 48. My plan was to go in from the benchmark Trailhead on the eastern side, follow the South Fork of the Sun River Trail back toward Gates Park, camp 2 nights, and come back out, roughly 40 miles round trip. My friend Priya Nadkarni dropped me at the Trailhead on a Tuesday morning, early August, and I remember her saying, only half joking, "Text me the second you're out," even though she knew as well as I did that there'd be no signal for most of the trip. I told her I'd check in on my satellite messenger each night, which I always did, a simple, all-good message that pinged her phone with my coordinates. The first day was exactly what I wanted it to be. Clear sky, temperatures in the low 70s, the trail mostly following the river through open meadows and stands of lodgepole pine. The kind of hiking where your mind finally goes quiet after months of not being quiet. I passed maybe 6 other hikers over the course of the day, a couple of groups heading out as I was heading in, exchanged the usual trail pleasantries. Nothing memorable. I want to be specific about the man because he's the center of everything that happened, and because I've gone back over every detail of our interactions so many times since that I could probably recite them verbatim. I first saw him around 2 p.m. that first day, maybe 8 miles in, resting at a spot where the trail crossed a side creek. He introduced himself as Simon, said he was solo backpacking too, heading in the same general direction, though he was vague about his exact plan in a way I didn't think much of at the time. A lot of backcountry hikers keep loose itineraries. He was maybe 40, fit, well-equipped, nothing about his gear or his manner that raised any flags. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, the way strangers do on a trail, and then I kept moving, since I prefer to hike at my own pace and don't love lingering with people I've just met, even in friendly circumstances. I saw him again that evening, at the backcountry campsite I'd planned to stop at, a spot near a bend in the river about 11 miles from the trailhead. He'd set up about 100 yards from where I chose to camp, which in a place with defined campsite areas isn't unusual, and he waved when he saw me, and I waved back, and I made dinner and read for a while and went to sleep without thinking much of it, other than a small familiar internal note that solo women in the backcountry make automatically. Know where the other camper is, don't advertise which tent is yours if you can help it. Keep the bear spray within reach regardless of bears. The first moment that actually unsettled me happened the next morning, my second day, around 7 a.m. I told him honestly that I preferred to hike alone, that it was actually the point of the trip for me, and he took it well on the surface. Said no worries, wished me a good hike, but something in his expression shifted for just a second before he smiled it away, something I registered more than I consciously noticed at the time. I hiked out ahead of him that morning, made good time, put what I estimated to be a couple hours of distance between us by early afternoon. The trail that day climbed up out of the river valley into more exposed terrain, switchbacks through burned forest from a fire a few years back, standing dead timber all around, silver gray and skeletal against the sky. It's beautiful in an eerie way, that kind of burned landscape, wide open, nowhere to hide, which is part of why what happened next has stuck with me the way it has. Around 3 p.m., I stopped for a break at a viewpoint, sat down on a rock, ate a granola bar, checked my map. I hadn't seen another person in almost 4 hours. When I stood up to keep moving, I happened to glance back down the switchbacks below me, and I saw him. Simon. Farther back than I expected, given the pace I'd been keeping, but closer than felt entirely comfortable, given how deliberately I thought I'd distanced I told myself that was fine, that trails funnel people together regardless of pace differences, that there was nothing inherently wrong with two hikers converging on the same trail toward the same destination. I kept moving, a little faster than before, and didn't see him again for the rest of the day. I reached my planned campsite for the second night around 6 p.m., a spot about 19 miles from the trailhead, near Gates Park itself, a wide open basin surrounded by dramatic limestone cliffs the Bob is known for. I set up camp, sent my satellite check into Priya. All good, gorgeous spot. One more night. Cooked dinner and settled in to watch the light change on the cliffs as the sun went down, which is genuinely one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life, and which I remember specifically because it's the last entirely peaceful moment of that trip. Simon showed up around 8 p.m., just as the light was fading, and asked, in a tone that had shifted from the friendly vagueness of the day before into something more insistent, whether he could camp near me that night. Said something about a spot he'd wanted to use being already taken, though I hadn't seen anyone else at all that day, and the basin was, from what I could tell, otherwise completely empty. I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that I'd rather he camp somewhere else, that I'd come out here specifically to be alone. He looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I remember consciously registering how alone we were, 19 miles from a trailhead, no cell signal, my satellite messenger, my only real link to anyone. And then he said, sure, no problem, and walked off toward the tree line at the edge of the basin. He did not, as far as I could tell, actually leave. I never saw him set up a tent anywhere else in the basin, though it's possible he did somewhere out of my sightline. What I know is that I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay in my tent with my headlamp off, bear spray held in my hand rather than just nearby, listening to every sound the wilderness makes at night, wind through burned timber, the river somewhere below, the occasional distant call of something I couldn't identify, and underneath all of it, or maybe because of all of it, a feeling that I was being watched that I could not shake no matter how many times I told myself it was exhaustion and isolation working on my nerves. At some point, I don't know exactly when, my phone read 1:52 a.m. when I finally worked up the nerve to check. I heard footsteps. Not the wind, not an animal, or at least not one I could convince myself was an animal. The rhythm was too even, too deliberate, moving slowly around the perimeter of my campsite, pausing, moving again. I lay absolutely still, gripping the bear spray, running through what I would do if my tent zipper started to move, and I want to be honest that in that moment I was more frightened than I have ever been in my life, more frightened than any bear encounter, any river crossing, any storm I'd weathered in the backcountry over 15 years of doing this. The footsteps stopped, eventually, somewhere close to my tent, close enough that I could hear breathing, or thought I could, over the sound of the wind and the river and my own pulse in my ears. I don't know how long that lasted. It felt like an hour. It was probably closer to 10 minutes. Then the footsteps moved away, back toward the tree line, and I lay there until the sky started to lighten around 5:30, at which point I packed my entire camp in under 15 minutes. The fastest I have ever broken down a site in my life, and started hiking out before full daylight. I didn't see Simon again I hiked the remaining 21 miles back to a different trailhead than planned. I'd rerouted my exit to Gibson Reservoir instead of doubling back to Benchmark, both to shorten the distance and, I'll admit, because some instinct told me not to retrace the same path. In a single push, which is not something I would ordinarily attempt, but adrenaline carries you further than you'd think. I sent Priya an early check-in, changing exit point, explain later, still safe, and called her the moment I had signaled near the trailhead, hands shaking as I dialed. I reported the encounter to a ranger station near Gibson Reservoir, spoke with a ranger named Dale Kirchner, who took it seriously, logged a description, said they'd keep an eye out for a solo male hiker matching Simon's description, and would flag it for other patrols in the Bob. He was kind about it, told me I'd made the right calls throughout, distancing myself, changing my exit route, not confronting him directly, and said that unfortunately, with a wilderness that size and that remote, actually locating someone who didn't want to be found was extremely difficult, especially without a last name or vehicle description, since I'd never actually seen where he'd parked. I want to tell you they found him, that there was some clean resolution, a name, an explanation, a reason his behavior had escalated the way it did over those 2 days. I don't have that. Ranger Kirchner called me about 10 days later to say they hadn't turned up anything. No matching reports from other hikers, no unclaimed vehicle at any of the trailheads that could be tied to him. Nothing. I still backpack. I haven't stopped, and I don't think I will, because it matters too much to me, and because I refuse to let 2 days out of 15 years take that away entirely. But I don't go alone into the deep backcountry the way I used to. I bring a friend now, or I stick to trails with more regular traffic, and I've started carrying a second satellite device as backup, which is probably overkill, but I don't care. The detail that still bothers me, the one I've never fully worked out, is this. When I broke camp that final morning at Gates Park, moving fast, barely looking at anything besides my gear, I noticed, only in passing, only because I happened to glance toward the tree line where I'd assumed Simon had gone to camp, that there were no signs of a tent site there at all. No flattened grass, no fire ring, nothing to suggest anyone had spent the night in that spot. Just untouched ground, dew still settled on the grass exactly as it would be if no one had walked through it in hours. I've told myself 100 times that he must have camped somewhere else in the basin, out of my line of sight, that the ground in a high alpine meadow can look undisturbed even after someone's been there, that I was exhausted and terrified and not exactly in a state to be reading terrain carefully. Almost all the time I believe that, but every now and then, usually when I'm setting up camp somewhere new, checking the tree line out of habit before I even realize I'm doing it, I think about that untouched patch of grass at Gates Park and the sound of footsteps circling my tent at 2 a.m, and I wonder what exactly was out there with me that night, and where it went. If you made it through all 4 of these, you already know the thing that ties them together isn't a monster or a curse or anything you can point a flashlight at. It's just distance. It's how far you are from another person when something goes wrong, and how long that drive, that call, that walk back to the truck actually takes when you're the one who needs it to be short. Every story in this video came from the same kind of place. A highway with no other cars on it, a rental house at the end of a gravel road, a gas station that closes when the sun goes down, a wilderness trail that swallows cell signal after the first mile. Places that are beautiful, precisely because nobody else is there. And then, every so often, somebody else is. None of these people got a clean answer. The trucker never learned who was in that gray sedan. The vet tech never played that recording for anyone else. The night clerk still doesn't know if 2 customers were working together or if it was all a coincidence her body refused to believe. The backpacker still checks the tree line out of habit. That's the part I keep coming back to. Real fear doesn't usually end with an explanation. It just ends with you being a little more careful than you used to be for the rest of your life, and never quite knowing if that carefulness is earned, or if it's just something that got left behind in you. If one of these stayed with you, tell me which one down in the comments, and let me know if you've ever had a moment like this yourself. The middle of nowhere, the feeling that you weren't as alone as you thought you were. I read every single one of them. Thank you for sitting with me through all 4 of these. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if this channel has helped you get through a long night shift, a late drive, or just kept you company in the dark, consider leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel more than you. Stay safe out there. Lock your doors. Trust the feeling in your gut when something's off. I'll see you in the next one.